All right, welcome to Peeling Syd Barrett. This will be episode 19. And in this episode, I want to discuss the song Scream Thy Last Scream, which is a fairly dark and judgmental song, I guess you could say. If it's meant to portray that, of course. It's very strangely worded, so you have to make assumptions about intent and meaning. But I think most people would come away from it thinking that it's kind of a negative song about someone. So let's go ahead and discuss, as we usually do, corrections or additions to previous songs. So the first thing I'd like to call out is that in reviewing some rhyming slang or slang in general terms, I've come to find out that apples for that era kind of was a slang term for barbiturate. So apples and oranges there could have a different meaning. Now, some people are inclined to think that the oranges might be referring to another form of drug. I haven't been able to locate anything like that that calls that out. One thing that does come to mind, of course, is Orange Sunshine, but that wasn't manufactured until 68 and 69, or widely acceptable. So these songs were recorded in 67. Therefore, it doesn't really make sense that it would be a reference to Orange Sunshine in the song Apples and Oranges. Another thing that I've kind of found out is that we had previously discussed in Vegetable Man the line lorry driver. And I do have a new book, which is a Dictionary of American Slang, compiled by Harold Wentworth and Stuart Berg Flexner, and Thomas Crowell Company, New York. And the copyright on this guy is in, looks like 1965, somewhere around there. So it is a dated version of slang, which is, of course, constantly changing, but there are a lot of old slang terms. And if you consider the possibility that a lorry driver or a truck driver could simply be a discussion of slang terms for truck and driver, which is a form of a delivery man, it does appear that that could be a reference to being her delivery man of some sort. Again, it could be another drug reference. So that's pretty much it for the additions and corrections to previous episodes, at least all I can think of at this time. Let's go ahead and take a look at the song. The song itself is pretty, I don't want to say terse, but it's there's not a whole lot melodically going on with the song. It just kind of opens right up into Scream Thy Last Scream. So let's go ahead and call out a few things that I noticed right off of the top of my head. Now, I do believe that there may have been a movie or a story that comes somewhat close to this title. I'm going to go see if I can find anything more about that a little bit later on. And if so, then I'll kind of include information here. But just in the title itself, let's consider what could possibly be going on here. Now, we've noted before that sometimes Mr. Barrett is referring to other people, and sometimes he's often referring to himself. So are there things happening at this time that could possibly make him possibly be calling himself an old woman? Now, old, of course, is a relative term. Old, a person can be 22 and consider themselves to be an old spirit or whatever. I don't know. Of course, it's a relative term. So when I was young, I thought people in their 30s were old. So the old term, of course, could be a reference to how they view themselves. Now, the idea of screaming your last scream, well, there's only so many different kinds of screams, so let's run through the different possibilities of screams, and we'll come to each one of them in turn. The first is simply that it's a scream, perhaps out of fear or dying. Another is that perhaps this is a scream of some sort that is tied to the idea of singing. Now, normally you wouldn't call singing screaming, but in the idea of rock and roll and howling, it isn't too far of a jump, I would say, to say that the screaming might be tied to that. And the last idea of a scream perhaps could be the idea of a scream not of pain or fear, but a scream of pleasure. So those are our three different types of screams that are possible. As we run through this, let's see if we can figure out maybe what's being referred to. Now, he mentions that she, the first line, he says she's an old woman and she's going to scream or less scream, and she has a casket. Now, a casket is kind of a symbolically loaded term. I couldn't find any slang that identifies what a casket could be. Of course, this is important to the song. The idea of a casket is tied to the idea of a coffin or a tomb. These are laden with female relations, female imageries, of course. A box is often used to refer to a woman's ability to procreate, etc. So it's also tied with the earth. It's also tied with the idea of death and all those things. So perhaps that is a reference in that way. I can't imagine what else the reference to a casket would be referring to. Then there's a couple of lines about blam blam and pointers, which makes no sense to me whatsoever, other than he's just fixating on sounds. I will point out that the blam blam is a kind of a comic book word. So there's another comic book reference. Now he says that she'll go waddling, and there's a mention of apples again. We mentioned before that apples, now we know, could be a reference to barbiturates, to Mrs. Storrs. Now there's another reference to Storrs. Now, if you remember in the song Apples and Oranges, there was another reference to different types of stores and merchandise and butchers and etc. And she's at the stores. So perhaps this is a reference to someone going to a dealer's house of some kind and picking up illicit drugs. Now there's a mention that she'll be scrumping. Scrumping again is, I have no idea what he means by that. It's another form of a slang word, I suppose, that makes sense to him. He mentions that she'll be on all fours like an animal, or perhaps like someone that's really down. And of course, barbiturates are downers. And then repeats his initial line. Now the next line is a tricky one. He mentions that she'll be flinging her arms madly, and calls her an old lady again. Now the flinging their arms madly, of course, could be various reasons. Could be really angry, could be someone who's in a fight, and could also be someone who's just kind of really high strung and is showing forms of anxiety. Now, of course, that's one of the reasons why people might take barbiturates, and of course that's kind of the story, and this has the feel to it of the song Mother's Little Helper by the Rolling Stones. And I'm not sure which one of these songs predates which, but it definitely has a feel of that, and as we get into it a little bit more, perhaps we'll see why this is a song that is similar to the song Mother's Little Helper. And it's right here in this line. He says she's an old lady with a daughter. Now, of course, this could simply be referring to someone that has a daughter or is going to have a daughter. I don't know, that he's related to. We've already kind of discussed the possibilities of that in a previous episode. Now, Cockney slang, daughter, is reverse from brick and mortar. So brick and mortar ties in with the idea of daughter, and that's important because in the very next line, he's discussing houses, flat tops and houses, houses. So he may be relaying the idea that a woman has traded in, or is trapped in, or is anxious about being in a house. And we'll find out more as we go on, and perhaps that's the reason for the apples. Flitting, hitting, fitting, quack, quack. I have no idea what that's all about. Of course, that could be another drug reference to flitting and hitting, because a lot of times hitting is used as a drug term for taking a hit. It's also, of course, could just be literal hitting, and of course it could just be, again, clanging on the itting, flittin', hittin', fittin', and then the quack quack. Now, the next line about watching a lot of television is perhaps something someone would do after they took a barbiturate, of course. He repeats the daughter line, and then the rest of it is all just repeated. So there are only so many ways that you can kind of read this song, in my opinion. One reading is that it doesn't mean anything, that it's just a collection of words that were perhaps interesting to Mr. Barrett. And I won't say that that can't be possible. He definitely likes to play around with words, and he may be doing so in this song. The second is that he may be referring to himself as a woman, and we've seen him do this before, of course, with sexual inversion. And the reason why he might be screaming his last scream, maybe because he's resolved to move on to other types of music, or perhaps not to sing anymore in the same way. The rest of the song, in that case, doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless he's referring to himself, of course, as being someone that's on apples and doing all these other things. Now, the last possible reference is that this is a form of a misogynistic, derogatory song about someone for some reason. Now, there is a reference to being on all fours and having a house, having a daughter, brick and mortar, and a casket. And I almost wonder if this isn't, again, a reference about a woman, perhaps, that is entering into what I guess you could call to be a form of white picket fence house relationship. Perhaps she's getting married. Perhaps she's trading in her screaming. In this case, the screaming would be perhaps a reference to screams of pleasure. So she will no longer be partaking in screams of pleasure or enjoying screams of pleasure, because she's going to perhaps get married and have a family, and that's why she'll be scrumping for apples on fours and have a house and be watching telly time, etc., and kind of be moving on to a new stage in her life. And of course, an old man and old woman, old man, old woman, were also slang terms for husband and wife. So the idea that like, you know, the old bag, the old man, you know, the old woman, the idea that this could simply be about a person that is entering, a woman that's entering into a relationship, and he's perhaps judging that person, or it's simply a song about that person, is one of the possibilities that this could be about. So why that may tie in all together, we'll get into a little bit more a bit later on, I suppose. I do think that a significant amount of his music is going to be very simple music in the future, and it's going to resolve almost entirely about personal relationships. And this seems to be pointing in that direction for whatever reason. Perhaps it was a topic that very much consumed him mentally or spiritually. In any case, there's, I guess, your three possibilities for what this song might be about. Could just be random, a collection of randomness that had a bunch of words that perhaps he enjoyed. It could be a song about himself moving on from being a singer, or at least a singer with a rock band, and moving into more kind of folk style music. And of course, his song Jug Band Blues was his last song released with the band, and that was just him playing on an acoustic guitar. And most of his music in the future, not all of it, but a lot of it is going to be done with acoustic guitar. Now, there are a lot of contextual elements that I want to kind of run through, and they are somewhat related, I guess you could say. Now, we've already discussed that perhaps Mr. Barrett might be relaying works of art with with songs. And of course, he did have a painting that he made that shows him, or shows someone screaming. There are other photographs and other works of art or covers for music that also famously kind of show people screaming. So one of the ones I'd like to point out is, of course, the cover for King Crimson, which is a person screaming. And of course, I'd like to point out the idea that King Crimson right there is a band with two things that are kind of Syd Barrett things. King, a royalty reference, and Crimson, which is a color, so the King of Red. And the cover itself, which shows a person screaming. There also is, famously, in the movie The Wall, the scream coming out in a cartoon form. And perhaps I'll show a picture of that. And there are three kind of close references there to the idea of a scream. And of course, Edvard Munch, also his most famous painting titled The Scream, which I'll cover up there, and of course, which shows a kind of skeletal skull shape screaming at the condition of the world because of a feeling of impending doom. So I do wonder if there isn't a feeling of impending doom that's kind of tied up into this song. Of course, there were a lot of artists at that time who were also considering the possibilities of impending doom. Now, Mr. Barrett did make a painting of a skull, and I will kind of show that here, or at least portions of it. Now, if you look very closely at the teeth, it does look like the skull is, his teeth are actually spelling something, and I can't quite make it out. Perhaps it's just an illusion because I can't see it really clearly, but it looks like the skull is kind of screaming "help," something along those lines, which is kind of another comic book reference. He did make a letter with flat for some reason. I don't know who he gave that to, but more interestingly, really quickly, I will point out, of course, that a lot of artists have taken on the idea of painting skulls, etc., and making odd things about them. One of the more interesting ones is, of course, made by Mr. Van Gogh, who did a skull with a burning cigarette, which is somewhat comical to some degree, I suppose. Of course, you're taking into consideration form and body function as an artist, the structure behind what you're painting, in order to accurately portray it to some degree. Most classically trained artists will study the, I don't know what you would call it, the structure of the body, so that they can build upon the structure of the body. That used to be very common. I don't know if that still happens now, but it certainly did happen then. And of course, Mr. Barrett also goes on to paint his own painting of the skull, as we referenced. Now, this consideration of human frailty and death, perhaps, is appropriate to the era because of a number of influences, and I'd like to point out a few of them. Now, of course, in the 60s was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and of course, not long before that had been the end of World War II, and acknowledgement of the destructive power of the atomic weapons. I'm not sure exactly when. I'm not entirely certain when that movie was made about loving the bomb, how I learned to stop fearing the bomb, or something like that. Anyway, and I can't remember his name right now. I'll put all that information up. I'm not sure exactly when that came out. It might have been around this time, but it's very hard for people now, when I talk with them, it's very hard for them to understand the danger of atomic weapons. It seems to be something that's kind of faded from the mind of a lot of people. Now, again, this isn't necessarily something that's tied directly to the song, but I will point out that it could have been something that was on Mr. Barrett's mind. And he did write a letter that shows the words "the end" and an atomic explosion. I'm not sure exactly when that was made, but it certainly was on his mind, and he was not alone in that. Mr. Warhol also made a series of atomic explosions. This was made in 1965. And there was an artist who was very, very concerned with the state of humanity, and he had good reason to be, and his name was Gustav Metzger. And I will perhaps let you read about Gustav Metzger on your own. He has a book called Actor Perish, which is kind of a collection of his ideas, his history, his life, and some of his works of destructive art. And I'm trying to find information on it for you, but I really can't see any. I don't even know if this is copyrighted. It doesn't have that. But Mr. Metzger, of course, was quite concerned with the state of the world because of the profusion and the possible destruction that could be caused by atomic weapons. On page 64 and 65, he has reference to an article called Actor Perish, and that kind of discusses perhaps it's a call to nonviolent action by Earl Russell and the Reverend Michael Scott, and it discusses some of the, I guess you could say, the concern not only with the situation but the concern with the inactivity of the general populace because they felt, I guess, unempowered to handle that situation. So there is quite a bit of history within Mr. Metzger, and perhaps quite a bit of him that would have been interesting to a man like Mr. Barrett. He was famous, of course, Mr. Metzger was famous for doing some acid paintings on sheets that would destroy the sheets as he was painting. And he also was fairly outspoken with his political views, not necessarily tied to any particular party, but he definitely was very concerned with the idea of the potential of destruction that was building within humanity, the potential to destroy itself. So I don't know that all those things are tied up necessarily in this song, Scream Thy Last Scream. I don't know that any of that is tied to the song itself. But certainly the idea of an ending, certainly the idea of losing someone, losing things, certainly the idea of a scream, and perhaps of a screaming skull in many cases, such as Mr. Edvard Munch's. They may have all been influences to some degree in this song. And I guess that's pretty much it. So hopefully you enjoyed this episode. If you haven't subscribed yet, please go ahead and subscribe, and if you like it, give it a like. Turn on your notifications so that you'll get updates. And in the next episode, I'm going to go over Jug Band Blues. We discussed it a little bit in the very, very beginning, and we're going to come back to it because this is the last really recognized published song that Mr. Barrett made with the band, and there's a lot in that song that I think that should be discussed. So we'll go through that, and then it's time to move on to other things. Perhaps discuss some other bands, perhaps discuss Mr. Barrett's solo career, or perhaps just be done. I don't know. Go ahead, let me know what your thoughts are. Give comments if you feel that they're warranted, or if you'd like to add anything in, or perhaps ask any questions. And that's it for today.